Harlem, 1935. The Cotton Club's back room was thick with cigar smoke and tension. Two men sat across from each other at a mahogany table that had witnessed 1,000 deals, 1,000 threats, 1,000 moments where power shifted hands like cards in a rigged game. But nothing like this, nothing like what was about to happen in the next 30 seconds. Dutch Schultz controlled the Bronx. He controlled the numbers racket across 3 boroughs. He had politicians in his pocket, cops on his payroll, and a reputation for violence that made grown men check over their shoulders on sunny afternoons. He killed at least 17 men personally, some said more, and he built an empire on fear, bullets, and the kind of ruthless calculation that kept him alive in a world where most gangsters didn't make it past. And 30. Across from him sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson, 40 years old, Harlem's quiet king. A man who'd risen from nothing, who'd survived prison, poverty, and every predator the streets could throw at him. He wore a simple gray suit, no flash, no diamonds, no peacocking. Just calm, just presence, just those eyes that seemed to see 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room. Dutch had come to make a deal, or rather, to issue an ultimatum dressed up as a deal. He wanted Harlem's numbers. The policy banks that Bumpy controlled, the weekly take that ran into hundreds of thousands of dollars, the lifeblood of the neighborhood. Dutch had already muscled his way into every other black neighborhood's racket in the city. Harlem was the last holdout, the last place his empire couldn't touch. And that drove him crazy. He brought 5 bodyguards. They stood along the walls, hands near their waistbands, eyes scanning the room like sharks sensing blood in the water. Bumpy had come alone. That should have been Dutch's first warning. So here's how this is gonna work, Dutch said, leaning forward, smoke curling from the cigar between his teeth. His voice carried that Bronx rasp, rough as gravel, used to being obeyed. You give me 60% of the Harlem take. I handle the cops, I handle the competition, I make sure nobody bothers your operations. You get to keep running things day to day. But I'm the bank, I'm the protection. You pay me, you stay alive. Simple. Bumpy didn't respond, didn't nod, didn't speak. He just looked at Dutch, really looked at him, and that's when everything changed. See, most people don't understand silence. They think it's passive, they think it's weakness, hesitation, fear, looking for an exit. But in the hands of someone who truly understands power, silence is the sharpest weapon in the room. It's a mirror. It forces the other person to see themselves, to hear their own heartbeat, to feel the weight of their words hanging in the air with no place to land. Dutch shifted in his seat, just slightly, just enough. Did you hear what I said? Dutch's voice had an edge now, irritation creeping in. I'm offering you a partnership here. I'm being generous. You understand what happens if you say no. Bumpy's expression didn't change. He didn't blink, didn't look away. He just held Dutch's gaze with the kind of stillness that monks spend decades trying to achieve. His hands rested on the table, relaxed, open, no tension in his shoulders, no anger in his face, just absolute, complete, terrifying calm. 10 seconds of silence. One of Dutch's bodyguards coughed. The sound echoed in the quiet like a gunshot. Another shifted his weight, the leather of his shoulder holster creaking. Dutch reached for his drink. Whiskey, neat, probably his third of the night, and his hand shook. Just a tremor. Just for a moment. But Bumpy saw it, and Dutch knew Bumpy saw it. 15 seconds. You think you're tough? Dutch's voice was louder now, trying to fill the space that Bumpy's silence had created. You think, because you run a few policy banks and the people in Harlem like you, that you can disrespect me? I've killed men for less. I've burned down entire operations for less. Bumpy still didn't speak, but something flickered in his eyes. Not fear, not anger, something worse. Pity. The look you give a child throwing a tantrum. The look that says, I see you, trying to be dangerous. And it's almost sad. 20 seconds. Dutch stood up fast, chair scraping back, his bodyguards tensed, hands moving to their weapons. The room held its breath. This was the moment. This was where it would break, either into violence or submission. Everyone expected one or the other, but Bumpy didn't move, didn't reach for a weapon, didn't stand to meet the challenge. He just kept looking at Dutch with those calm, knowing eyes, and in that moment, Dutch Schultz, who'd stared down cops and judges and rival mobsters, who'd ordered executions over breakfast and slept like a baby afterward, felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. He felt small. 25 seconds. The thing about real power is that it doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need threats or raised voices or displays of force. Real power is the difference between a man who carries a gun because he needs to and a man who doesn't carry a gun because everyone already knows what he's capable of. Real power is the ability to make someone question their entire strategy, their entire approach, their entire existence without saying a single word. Dutch's face was red now. Partly anger, partly something else. Embarrassment, the dawning realization that he'd miscalculated, that he'd walked into this meeting thinking he was the wolf and discovered he'd been talking to something far more dangerous, something patient, something that didn't need to growl to be feared. 30 seconds. Then Bumpy spoke, just 2 words, quiet, almost gentle. Leave Harlem. Not a threat, not a negotiation, not even particularly emotional. Just a simple statement of fact, delivered with the same energy you might use to mention the weather, or suggest someone tried the chicken instead of the fish. Dutch opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Nothing came out. His bodyguards looked at each other, uncertain, waiting for orders that weren't coming. The power dynamic in the room had shifted so completely, so thoroughly, that everyone could feel it. It was like watching gravity reverse. You don't know who you're dealing with. Dutch finally managed, but his voice lacked conviction. It sounded like a recording of himself, played back at the wrong speed. Bumpy stood now. Slowly, gracefully. He buttoned his suit jacket with precise, unhurried movements. Then he did something that would become Harlem legend. He walked past Dutch Schultz, walked within 2 feet of the most violent man in New York, and Dutch didn't move. Couldn't move. His bodyguards watched, paralyzed, as Bumpy opened the door and left the Cotton Club without another word. The meeting had lasted 3 minutes. 30 seconds of it had rewritten the city's criminal landscape. Within a week, Dutch Schultz pulled every operation he had out of Harlem. Not gradually, not with face-saving negotiations, completely. His collectors vanished overnight. His enforcers found other territories. His policy, banks and black neighborhoods across the city were quietly sold or abandoned. The most feared man in New York had been defeated by silence and a stare. People tried to understand it. They created theories. Some said Bumpy had dirt on Dutch, some secret so dark that he couldn't risk it coming out. Others claimed Bumpy had connections with the Italian families that Dutch couldn't afford to cross. A few whispered about supernatural explanations, about curses and bad juju, and the kind of power that couldn't be explained by bullets or money. But the truth was simpler and more profound. What happened in that room wasn't about information or connections or mysticism. It was about the difference between a man who needs to prove he's powerful and a man who simply is. The Dutch had spent his entire life building a reputation through violence and fear. Bumpy had built his through something deeper, respect, intelligence, and an understanding of human nature, so complete that he could dismantle a man's confidence without raising his voice. The old-timers in Harlem who were there, who worked in the Cotton Club that night, they'd tell you about the moment Bumpy left. How Dutch stood there for a full minute, staring at the closed door, how his hands were shaking, how he turned to his bodyguards and snapped at them to move, Let's go, get out, his voice cracking like thin ice. How he didn't make eye contact with anyone as he rushed out the back entrance. One of those bodyguards, a man named Tommy, who later got out of the life and moved to Philadelphia, he said something years later that captured it perfectly. He said, "I've seen Dutch Schultz kill a man for spilling a drink on his shoe. I've seen him torture guys for information. I've seen him face down cops with machine guns, but I never saw him scared until Bumpy Johnson looked at him for 30 seconds and said nothing. That silence was louder than every gunshot I ever heard." The lesson here isn't complicated, but it's one that most people never learn. Power isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's not about having the most guns or the biggest crew or the scariest reputation. Real power is about knowing yourself so completely, understanding the game so thoroughly that you can win without fighting. It's about the confidence that comes from genuine strength, not the insecurity that demands constant validation. Dutch Schultz died 3 years later, shot multiple times in the Palace Chop House in Newark. He'd made too many enemies, pushed too hard, threatened too many people. He died the way he lived, violently, messily, surrounded by blood and chaos. Bumpy Johnson lived into his 60s. He died of a heart attack in Harlem, in the neighborhood he'd protected for decades. When he died, thousands came to his funeral. The streets were lined with people who remembered him not as a gangster, but as a protector. Someone who'd kept the neighborhood safe when the law wouldn't. Someone who'd stood up to every threat that came through. And usually, just like with Dutch Schultz, he'd won by being smarter, calmer, more strategic than anyone expected. That 30-second stare changed everything. It became shorthand in the underworld. When someone was trying to intimidate you and failing, you'd say they were pulling a Dutch. When someone needed to be reminded of their place, people would suggest giving them the Bumpy treatment. The story grew over the years, as all legends do. Some versions had this stare lasting a full minute. Others added details about Bumpy's eyes seeming to glow in the dim light. A few claimed you could hear a pin drop in the Cotton Club that night, that even the jazz band in the other room somehow went quiet. But the core truth remained. 2 men walked into a room. One controlled the Bronx and wanted to control Harlem. The other controlled Harlem and had no intention of sharing. No shots were fired. No punches were thrown. No threats were made. Well, just 2 words, delivered like a weather report. And when it was over, one man owned the city and the other was looking over his shoulder for the rest of his short life. So what would you have done if you were Dutch Schultz, walking into what you thought was an easy negotiation with a smaller operator, and you suddenly realized you'd made a terrible mistake? Would you have doubled down, tried to save face with violence? Would you have left quietly, like Dutch did? Would you have recognized the signs earlier? The fact that Bumpy came alone, the calmness in his posture, the absolute confidence that doesn't need bodyguards. And if you were Bumpy, how would you have handled it? Would you have used words, tried to negotiate, attempted to find middle ground? Or would you have understood, like he did, that sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all? That sometimes the way to win is to simply be so unmovable, so certain of your position, that the other person defeats themselves? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe if you want more stories about the moments when real power revealed itself. Not through violence, but through the kind of psychological warfare that changed history without firing a shot. Hit that notification bell because next week we're diving into another legendary confrontation where silence and strategy beat guns and threats. And if you think you know how these old school power plays worked, trust me, you haven't heard the half of it yet.